The single father returned after 3 years, opened the door, and froze in shock. His 7-year-old son was carrying his 1-year-old sister on his back, his hands red and raw as he scrubbed the bathtub. The man's next action left the entire neighborhood stunned. "Ethan, Daddy's home." Michael's voice still lingered in the air when the dripping faucet took over. Drip, drip, the sponge scraped against the porcelain sink with a faint squeak, the labored breathing of a child mixing with the soft sniffling of a baby. Michael stood at the doorway, his hand still clutching the strap of his worn backpack. The familiar sting of bleach mixed with the musty dampness made his nose tighten. 3 years away came rushing back in a single heartbeat. He remembered the rented room in Denver, the whir of the lathe, the nights he sat counting every dollar to pay off hospital bills. His wife had died of cancer. He had signed the loan papers, left Brookfield with a promise to return soon, entrusting his son to his late wife's sister. He had believed it was the right thing to do, but the sight before him now crushed his chest like a fist. His 7-year-old boy, thin and bony, carried a baby girl of barely a year slumped against his back, while his cracked little hands gripped a sponge and scrubbed over and over around the bathtub's rim. His faded t-shirt clung wet to his body, his hair plastered damp against his neck. Emily stirred, letting out a tiny whimper, her flushed cheek pressed into her brother's shoulder. Michael stepped inside without thinking. The longer he looked, the tighter his throat closed. Beside them sat a plastic bucket filled with soapy water, the stinging smell of detergent rising harsh in the air. On the shelf above, a stub of candle still showed a trail of soot. A thin rag hung over the railing, drops of water falling steadily. He didn't need anyone to tell him this was not the first time. The way the boy braced his shoulders to balance the baby, the careful placement of his toes, the deep breath before scrubbing in perfect circles, these were habits carved into routine. My son?" Michael called softly, his voice instinctively lowered as if afraid to wake the baby girl. Ethan flinched. His large eyes turned, sharp and guarded like an adult's. He stared straight at Michael, not searching, not relieved, but waiting for an order. "I have to clean it right. Aunt said I don't get to eat until it's done." His voice was hoarse and small, but every word was clear. Soap clung to the cracks of his raw knuckles. A thin scratch ran from his wrist halfway up his arm, likely from scrubbing too hard for too many days. Michael's first impulse was to reach for Emily. He stepped closer, but she suddenly whimpered, her small body curling tighter, her tiny hand clutching her brother's collar. Ethan instantly shifted back half a step, steadying himself, soothing her gently. "Easy, little one. It's okay. I'm here." His voice softened like a grown man calming a child, without a trace of clumsiness. He tilted his head toward Michael, murmuring almost unconsciously, "Don't come too close. She'll be scared." Michael stopped. He drew in a long breath, then lowered himself so he was beneath his son's eye level, both palms open, his voice softening. "I'm your father. I won't touch you if you don't want me to. I just want to look at you." The word father slipped from his mouth like a late apology. 3 years of laboring on distant construction sites, the unanswered phone calls, the messages that never came back, all of it collapsed into this single moment. He could see clearly how the boy's small shoulders tensed like a fragile roof, sheltering another child. Michael stepped closer. "Let me hold your sister, so you can rest your hands." Ethan backed up half a step, clutching the baby tightly, his shoulders stiff. "No, Aunt Margaret said if it's not finished, we don't get to eat. If she cries," Aunt Margaret yells, "I just need to finish quickly and it'll be okay." "You're back, are you?" Margaret stepped out from the back room, her voice flat as if explanations no longer interested her. Her hair was tied high, a ring of keys dangling from her neck. She glanced at the bathtub, then at Michael, the corner of her mouth lifting into a thin line. "Perfect timing. Come and see this dump. He hasn't scrubbed it clean yet." Michael turned to face her. "He's just a child." "So what if he is?" Margaret shrugged. "He lives here, eats here, uses what's here. He has to work. You disappeared for 3 years. Now you come back preaching morals?" She flicked her eyes toward the boy. "Hurry up, Ethan." Ethan bit his lip, picked up the sponge again. Emily whimpered. Michael reached out and took her into his arms. She clung to his neck, her flushed cheek pressed against the worn fabric of his shirt. That small embrace shook Michael to his core. He held the little girl close, then looked down at his son's trembling hands working in the soap suds. "What have they eaten today?" "I told you, that's my business." Margaret waved him off. "I still need to go get money for milk. Get out of the way." There's plenty left to do in this house. Michael swallowed hard. His eyes swept the room. A plastic basin sat on the tile floor. A few small clothes hung loosely from a hook. A threadbare towel frayed at the edges. No scent of food lingered, only the sting of bleach and damp mildew. "Ethan, come here." The boy hesitated, then moved a little closer out of reflex, his eyes still fixed on the tub. Michael lowered his voice. "Are you hungry?" Ethan darted a glance toward Margaret and shook his head slightly. "I need to finish first." Margaret let out a harsh laugh. "See? He knows better." She walked straight into the kitchen. "In this house, no one gets to be lazy. Not even you." Michael watched closely. His hand rested on his son's shoulder, warm but trembling. He wanted to say so much, to ask, to shout, but every word seemed to lodge in his throat. In the end, he only managed one sentence. "I'm sorry, son." Ethan's eyes widened. "Why are you apologizing, Dad? I'm used to it." Michael bent down to pick up the sponge, intending to scrub the tub himself. Ethan quickly grabbed it back and shook his head. "Dad, just hold Emily for me so I can finish faster. Aunt Margaret doesn't like anyone else touching things." "What things?" Michael couldn't hold back. "This bathtub doesn't even belong to her." Margaret walked out from the kitchen, turning a ring of keys in her palm like it was second nature. "Doesn't matter whose it is. What matters is that it's clean. And clean means he does it." She pointed at Ethan. "He's staying here, not living for free." "Staying here," Michael repeated, his voice hoarse. "And what about the child support money? Where does that go?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I buy groceries. I pay for gas. I take care of my own child. You got a problem with that?" Emily let out a small hiccup, her tiny arms searching for milk that wasn't there. Michael held her tighter, patting her back. "She needs milk. I'll get some tomorrow. She's hungry today. Not everything comes the moment you want it." Margaret turned away, her voice flat with boredom. "You just got back. Rest up. Don't get in the way." Ethan bent back over the tub, moving the sponge in careful circles, as if afraid to scratch the porcelain. His eyes dropped, his thin back hunched beneath the weight of his baby sister. Michael watched his son's small hands trembling in the soap suds. Every crack across his knuckles cut into Michael's chest like a blade. All the words of anger, scolding, and outrage twisted together into a heavy knot pressing down on his lungs. He stepped into the living room, forcing his voice to stay calm. "From now on, I'm staying here with my kids." "Stay wherever you want," Margaret replied evenly. "But in this house, you eat by the rules. And in my house, everything has a lock. I don't want food disappearing like magic." The room fell silent. Emily breathed softly in Michael's arms. In the bathroom, Ethan kept scrubbing one more circle, then another. Each drop of water fell with a slow, steady rhythm, cutting into Michael's heart like a knife. Margaret walked up to the refrigerator, bent down to open the padlock, slid the key in, and turned it once. The door swung open, and a wave of cold air brushed against her face. She reached inside, pulled out a bag of chips, twisted the cap off a soda bottle, took a long gulp, and then calmly locked it again. The ring of keys clinked against each other with a dry sound. Michael stood in the middle of the kitchen holding Emily, his eyes fixed on the lock that had just clicked shut. His voice was steady, neither raised nor lowered. "Why do you lock it? They're children. They need to eat." Margaret wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and smirked. "The welfare check comes to me. I raise them my way. You disappeared for 3 years, abandoned them, and now you think you have the right to question me." Ethan clutched the sleeve of his father's shirt, then quickly let go, as if afraid of showing his own weakness. The boy backed toward the corner of the room, eyes fixed on his plastic sandals. Michael caught a fleeting glance from him, one that carried both fear and longing, like a tiny flame that flickered and quickly tried to hide itself. "That's my son," Michael said slowly, each word heavy and hard. "And this little one is your daughter. She needs a mother, and you haven't been one." Margaret slammed the soda bottle down on the table. "Don't preach to me. I've kept them fed enough. They live in my house. They eat in my house. So they follow my rules in my house." Michael took half a step forward, then stopped. He was afraid that raising his voice would startle Emily. She was resting her small head on his shoulder, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck as if clinging to the last safe place she knew. He drew in a breath and looked straight at Margaret. "Enough is when the children are no longer afraid of being hungry. Enough is when my son doesn't have to work just to earn a meal." Margaret let out a harsh, dry laugh. "And you think a bathtub scrubs itself? He's learning discipline, and that's a good thing." And you, if you plan to stay, you'd better learn the rules too." The front door creaked softly. A figure stood in the doorway, carrying a woven basket in one hand. "Good evening." The man's voice was raspy but warm, unhurried. "I brought some fresh bread." Michael turned toward him. The man was in his 60s, his neatly cut gray hair framing a face lined but steady. His dark shirt was old but pressed clean. He set the basket of bread on the table, the soft scent of fresh loaves filling the room. "Mr. Thompson," Michael said quietly. Mr. Henry Thompson was a longtime neighbor, once a carpenter at the shop down the street. People respected him for being quiet but fair. He glanced at the ring of keys hanging from Margaret's neck, then at Ethan pressed against the wall, and finally at Emily sleeping soundly in Michael's arms. He let out a faint sigh. "Looks like I came at the right time." Margaret crossed her arms, her eyes cold. "You can come whenever you want. This house doesn't take handouts." Mr. Henry Thompson didn't respond. He took a loaf of bread, broke it in half, and handed a piece to Ethan. "Eat, son. It just came out of the oven." Ethan looked over at Margaret as if waiting for permission. Margaret shot him a sharp glance. "He doesn't eat until the work is finished." Michael was about to speak, but Mr. Thompson had already placed the other half of the loaf on the table, sliding it toward him. His voice was steady, not harsh. "Children doing chores isn't discipline. It's a burden. I'm an old man. I've seen a lot, and I've witnessed more than you think, Michael." Margaret's tone cut like steel. "Whose side are you on?" Mr. Thompson lifted his eyes. "I stand on the side of what's right." He turned to Michael, speaking slowly as if not to break a fragile thread. "If you want to know how your son has been living, come to my house tonight. I'll brew some coffee. I'll tell you everything from start to finish." Michael swallowed hard, his hand pressing gently against Emily's back as if to steady both children. He gave a short nod. "I'll come." Margaret snatched the bread basket, slammed it down as if to erase the warmth that had just spread through the kitchen. "Food from one house stays in that house. There are rules here." Mr. Thompson didn't argue. He looked at Ethan with eyes kind but firm, then turned back to Michael. "Don't let a 7-year-old decide when he gets to eat. Adults should decide with love." He gave a small nod of farewell and stepped back toward the door. Before leaving, he paused, speaking softly enough for only father and children to hear. "Don't say anything more right now. Stay calm. Tonight." The door closed, leaving only the faint rattle of the keys hanging around Margaret's neck, like a cold reminder. Michael looked at his son. Ethan looked back, lips moving but no words coming out. Emily burrowed deeper into his chest, her breathing steadier. Margaret turned her back toward the bedroom, speaking like she was laying down law as she walked away. "Tonight, you'll eat after the work is done. Don't expect surprises." Michael stood still for a long moment. He laid Emily gently onto a chair, covering her with a thin blanket, then walked over to Ethan. "Wash your hands, then sit here with me for a while." Ethan hesitated, but tears welled suddenly at the corners of his eyes. He nodded, scrubbed his hands quickly under the faucet, and sat at the edge of the chair, his back straight, hands folded tightly on his lap as if afraid to do something wrong. Michael's eyes followed the sound of Margaret's keys disappearing behind the bedroom door. He knew tonight would be the first turning point, and he also knew he could not take another slow step. Outside on the porch, the late afternoon sun leaned across the shingles. In the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread still lingered. Michael quietly pushed the other half of the loaf closer to Ethan. This time, the boy glanced at his father, saw the nod, broke off a small piece, and chewed slowly, as if relearning what it meant to eat without fear. At the end of the hallway, Margaret's voice echoed, cold as a lock snapping shut. "When the work is done, call me." Michael didn't answer. He looked at the clock on the wall, then at the door. Tonight, he would listen. And then, he would act. The creak of a wooden chair echoed in the small yard of Mr. Henry Thompson's house. He set 2 clay mugs on the table and poured coffee, steam rising in gentle swirls. Michael Carter sat across from him, one hand pressed against his forehead, the other gripping the mug to steady his trembling fingers. Night had already settled, and the soft glow of a yellow lamp spilled from inside the house. Mr. Thompson, now past 60, sat upright, his eyes steady but kind. He had once worked as a carpenter at the shop down the street, and everyone knew him as a man of few words but of fairness. He slid the mug of coffee toward Michael. "Drink, son." Michael gave a slight nod. He took a sip and waited in silence. Mr. Thompson slowly set his spoon down and lifted his gaze. "I'll start from the beginning. More than once, I saw Ethan at the bakery on the corner. He would stand off to the side, waiting until the trays were cleared, then ask for whatever leftovers were there. Not once did he eat it right away. He'd break it apart and put it in his little sister's hands first. Only when she was done would he take a tiny bite for himself. Michael's hand clenched tight on his knee, fingernails pressing into his skin. He didn't interrupt, only stared at the rim of his cup, the steam blurring his eyes. Mr. Thompson continued, his voice steady and unhurried. One day it was pouring rain. I ran over to the corner store to get out of the storm, and I saw the boy standing outside the awning, his jacket soaked through, while Emily was curled up inside it. He hunched his body to block the wind, patting her back in a steady rhythm. I called him in, but he shook his head and said he had to wait for his aunt. He was afraid of being scolded for going somewhere on his own. Michael swallowed back a sob. He drew in a deep breath, but it broke halfway. And, Emily, did she cry much, Henry? Until she was hoarse, Mr. Thompson answered softly. Even late at night, I could still hear it. I knocked on the door more than once. Every time it was the same, the bolt sliding shut, the harsh voice of an adult, and then silence from the children. The yard was still. The faint clink of a spoon against a mug was the only sound. Michael lifted his cup, but didn't drink. His lips were dry, his eyes bloodshot. What kind of father have I been? Mr. Thompson looked directly at him, neither blaming nor consoling. You can make it right if you choose to stand up. But remember, that boy is watching you every single day. He'll believe what you do, not what you say. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. Tears spilled over, running down the back of his hand. He tried to hold them back but couldn't. His whole body shook in a short, sharp tremor. Mr. Thompson stood, laid his calloused hand on Michael's shoulder, and gave it a firm squeeze. Crying won't save him. Action will. Michael nodded. He set the cup down, his voice hoarse. I'll do it. Where do I start, Mr. Thompson? Starting tomorrow, Mr. Henry Thompson said, pronouncing each word firmly. You go to Ethan's school. Talk to his teacher. Ask her to tell you how the boy is doing in class, whether he has been unusually silent, and ask her to testify if needed. I will also write down everything I've seen, not to shame anyone, but to protect the children. He pulled an old cell phone from a wooden drawer and scrolled through a few photos. One showed, from a distance, the silhouette of a child holding his little sister under the rain-soaked porch. Another showed an empty tray with two small hands next to it. Mr. Thompson didn't bring them too close, only held them out just enough, as if afraid of hurting the boy once more. I've kept these pictures because I thought there would come a time when they'd be needed. The iron gate outside creaked softly. A woman's voice called in, polite yet firm. Excuse me, is this Mr. Thompson's house? Mr. Thompson opened the gate. A woman in her early 30s stood there, her hair neatly tied back, carrying a canvas bag and holding a folder of documents. A name tag pinned to her chest read, Laura Miller. She bowed slightly, her eyes quick but warm. I'm Laura Miller, Ethan's homeroom teacher. I came by to return his notebook and also to check in. Michael shot to his feet, stumbling a little in his introduction. Miss Miller looked at him, paused for a brief moment, then spoke slowly. You're Ethan's father. That's good, I was just about to look for you. There are some things I think you need to know. And there's something you need to see. She opened the folder, pulled out a pencil drawing, and placed it gently on the table. Mr. Thompson stepped back, leaving Michael face to face with the paper. Miss Miller spoke softly, clearly, as if afraid of tearing something fragile. You need to look at this. The sheet slipped out of the folder and hit the floor, revealing rough pencil lines still dusted with eraser marks. Michael bent down to pick it up. His fingers trembled slightly. Miss Laura Miller closed the gate and invited him into Mr. Henry Thompson's small living room. She sat across from him, placing the rest of the folder on the table. Her voice was low, unhurried. I don't want to alarm you, but you need to see this. On the paper was a drawing of a thin boy carrying a baby on his back, his free hand scrubbing a tub streaked with gray. Drops of water fell in midair. 2 dark streaks ran down from the boy's eyes, the pencil pressed so hard it had torn through the paper. In the corner, a large key was drawn out of proportion. Beneath it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, I'll clean it. Michael lifted the drawing closer. His breathing faltered. Everything matched what he had just witnessed, even the curve of the boy's back hunched from holding the child. He swallowed hard, eyes burning. Ethan hardly speaks, Miss Miller continued. I call on him, I ask questions. I give him time to draw freely, and he chooses silence. But his drawings are his cry for help. He always draws himself working, always with the baby on his back, always with water. Michael whispered, his voice breaking, "My son, he's had to endure this?" "Miss?" Miller nodded gently. "I've also noticed other things. When the class receives snacks, he puts his portion into his bag and says it's for his sister. If I suggest he eat right away, he refuses. During recess, he doesn't go to the playground, he stays near the door. He checks the clock over and over, like he's afraid of being late for chores at home." "Mr. Thompson added quietly, his voice steady and warm. "When a child worries about the clock like an adult, something is wrong." "Miss?" Miller opened another sheet. This one he drew last week. He drew a table with 2 bowls. In the left bowl there are a few gray pencil marks. The right one is empty. When I asked why, he said the empty bowl was his, because he saves it for his sister. Michael gripped the drawing tighter, his nail catching on the tear near the boy's penciled eyes. He drew in a long breath, trying to steady himself. "What do I need to do, Miss Miller?" "You are his only hope," she replied. "If you stay silent, these drawings will keep repeating. I can file a school report describing his behavior, his schedules, his emotional signs. I can testify as a witness. The school also has a counselor who can support Ethan later." The gate creaked again. Small footsteps approached. Ethan peeked in, his school bag clutched against his chest, chalk dust still on his face. He froze in the doorway when he saw his father holding the drawing. Father and son's eyes met close yet hesitant. Michael set the drawing down on the table and beckoned. "Come here, son." Ethan walked forward slowly, his eyes never leaving the drawing. He pulled the strap of his backpack tighter, as if that could hold his composure together. "When did you draw this?" Michael asked, his voice soft, as if touching a wound. "During art class," Ethan answered quietly. "The teacher told us to draw what we think about the most." Miss Laura Miller spoke gently to Ethan. "I'm here. You don't have to be afraid." Ethan looked at her, then at Mr. Henry Thompson, and finally turned back toward his father. He pointed to the corner of the paper, where a large key was drawn with hard, heavy lines. "I drew this because this decides when we get to eat." Michael felt the sound of his own heartbeat drop. He reached out, but stopped halfway, afraid the boy would flinch. "You don't have to draw the things that scare you anymore. You can draw what you want." Ethan was silent for a long while. Then he pulled the paper back toward himself and flipped it over. The back was blank except for a faint gray smear from pencil marks pressed through. He took a pencil from his backpack and carefully drew 3 stick figures sitting side by side. In the middle was a tall figure holding a smaller child. Above them, he drew a round light bulb, its light radiating out in short lines. Michael followed each stroke, his throat finally opening to a steady breath. "What is this?" he asked, though he already knew. "It's our home," Ethan said. "If we had light." Miss Miller turned to Michael. "I'll write the report tonight. Tomorrow you can go to Child Protective Services. I'll go with you if needed." Mr. Thompson nodded. "I'll write a statement too. I'll hand over the photos I've kept." Ethan lifted his eyes, the tension softening. "Dad, are you coming home?" Michael didn't hesitate. "I'm here. I'm not leaving again." The answer fell like a vow. Ethan touched the edge of the paper with his fingertip, turning it slightly, as if trying to fasten the light he had just drawn. Miss Miller stood, gathering her folder. "I need to return to school for a parent meeting. Here's my card. It has my phone number. Call anytime you need." Michael accepted the card, slipping it into his shirt pocket. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing my son." Mr. Thompson walked her to the gate. Before leaving, Miss Miller paused for a moment and spoke quietly to Michael. "Tonight, let him sleep early. Tomorrow we begin." The yard fell quiet again. Mr. Thompson came back inside, resting a hand on Michael's shoulder. "And I'm right next door. Knock, and I'll be there." Michael nodded. He turned to Ethan. "Do you want to take this drawing home?" Ethan hugged the paper to his chest. "I do." "Then fold it carefully," Michael said. "Don't let it tear again." Ethan did as told, slowly but steadily. He slid the drawing into the plastic cover of his workbook, pressing the edges flat. The careful gesture reminded Michael of how his son guarded the few small things left to him. On the way home, Michael walked close beside his son. He didn't say much. Each time Ethan stiffened at some sudden sound, Michael placed his hand on the boy's back, pressing lightly, a reminder, "Dad is here." When they reached the door, Ethan hesitated. From inside came the faint, cold clinking of keys. Michael bent down and whispered, "Come in with me." Ethan nodded. He stepped in, gripping the plastic cover tightly in his hand. In Michael's mind, the drawing stayed vivid. The oversized key, the falling drops of water, the bent back, and on the reverse side, a glowing light. He grasped the edge of the cover Ethan was holding, as if seizing the outline of a decision. "I won't let this scene repeat again." The sound of keys clinking echoed in the dark from Margaret's room. Michael set Emily down on a chair, covered her with a thin blanket, then stepped in front of the kitchen and the hallway. He wasn't backing away anymore. "Margaret, tonight we settle this." She stepped out, the keyring swinging from her neck, her eyes tired but cold. She opened the cupboard, pulled out a glass, poured water, and drank slowly as if stretching the silence. When she set the glass down, her lips curved in a faint smirk. "Settle what? This house hasn't changed. The people here haven't changed. You're just the one who decided to come back." Michael kept his voice steady. "You no longer have the right to treat them this way." Margaret let out a sharp laugh. "You abandoned your kids for 3 years, and now you come back to lecture me? They're your children, but they survived because of me." Michael didn't budge. "They survived because of themselves, because of those small hands, not because of you. From now on, the refrigerator won't be locked. Children who are hungry should eat, and Ethan is not your servant." Margaret crossed her arms, leaning against the table. "In my house, it's my rules. You want to eat, you work. That's fair. And you, if you plan to stay here, you'd better learn to stay quiet. Silence is what I've done for far too long." Michael stepped half a pace closer. "That ends tonight." Ethan stood pressed against the corner, clutching the plastic folder with his drawings. He looked at his father, then at the keys. His lips trembled. He swallowed hard, then spoke, his voice hoarse, low but clear. "I'm not afraid of hardship. I'm only afraid of losing you again." The kitchen froze. Michael turned sharply and pulled the boy into his arms. He held him tight against his chest, his other hand patting a steady rhythm on his back. "I'm here. Do you hear me? I'm here." Emily, startled at his urgent voice, burst into tears and kicked her little legs. Michael bent down, scooped her up, and placed her between them, so the three of them could feel each other's warmth. Margaret tapped her nails on the table, each strike dry and sharp. "All right. Are we done with the touching family scene? I've raised them for 3 years. The support checks, the gas, the electricity, the water, who paid for it? You? Don't talk to me about fairness with nothing but promises." Michael stared straight at her. "Tomorrow I'll be at Child Protective Services. I have witnesses, I have the teacher's report, I have photos. Do you want me to list the names? And what would that prove?" Margaret lifted her chin. "I've always said it. They're here because of me. I won't let you take away what keeps me alive." The words shot out, raw and blunt. Her hand tightened on the keys, the metallic clatter biting into the air. Michael froze for half a second. He set Emily back on the chair, shielding her with his arm, then stood squarely in front of both children. "What keeps you alive is not a child," Michael said slowly, each word pressed hard. "Don't you ever say that again in front of them." Margaret glared. "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement," Michael answered. "From now on, you don't touch them with commands or with locks." Ethan tugged gently at his father's sleeve, as if reminding him to stay calm. Michael lowered his voice. "Take your sister into the room, lock the door from the inside, sit with her. Don't open for anyone but me." Ethan glanced at Margaret for a brief moment, then nodded. He lifted Emily into his arms, clumsy but firm, and hurried down the hallway. Margaret started to step in front of him, but Michael moved forward, blocking her path. She froze, watching the two children disappear behind the door, the faint click of the lock echoing. Margaret ground her teeth. "So, you're playing hardball. Fine, I have my own ways. Your way is locking the refrigerator and forcing a child to work," Michael said. "My way is opening doors and taking them to the doctor, to school, and letting them sleep early." She let out a cold laugh. "You think the agency is going to believe someone who just came back?" "I don't think." Michael shook his head. "I'm prepared." She shot up from her chair, leaned close, and jabbed a finger into his chest. "I will not let you take away the one thing that keeps me alive." At that exact moment, footsteps stopped on the porch. They weren't the hesitant steps of curious neighbors. They were steady, deliberate, fearless. A shadow appeared against the screen door. 3 firm knocks echoed, even and clear. Margaret flinched, retreating half a step, her hand instinctively covering the ring of keys on her chest. Michael turned, and for the first time that night, his heart settled with a strange calm. He opened the door. A woman of about 35 stood there, her hair tied neatly back, dressed in a simple coat, an ID card hanging from her neck. The badge read, Karen Lopez, social worker, CPS. Her eyes were steady, scanning quickly over the kitchen, the refrigerator with a padlock, the 2 children's belongings on the chairs, then finally resting on Michael. "Good evening," she said slowly, her voice soft yet firm. "I am Miss Lopez, a social worker with Child Protective Services. I'm here following reports from the school and several neighbors." Behind her, the glow of the street lamp spilled gold across the doorway. She tilted her head slightly, as if confirming what she had already suspected. Then her gaze moved deeper into the house where Margaret stood, clutching the keys tightly in her hand. She did not step inside immediately, but it was clear she had heard enough. And in that fragile silence, Michael understood that every word spoken in this kitchen tonight would no longer be swallowed by the dark. The sound of the gavel striking the table cracked sharply through the air. The small hearing room at Child Protective Services fell silent. Michael Carter sat upright, his left hand gripping Ethan's tightly, his right arm supporting Emily, who was dozing against him. Across from him sat Margaret Harris, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep but her voice still sharp. Beside the presiding table, Miss Karen Lopez, the social worker, opened the case file. Her tone was calm and precise with each word. Case number 274, current guardian, Mrs. Margaret Harris. Children involved, Ethan Carter, 7 years old, and Emily Carter, 1 year old. Reported concerns: refrigerator locked with padlock, household labor imposed on a minor child, and suspected misuse of child support funds. Margaret leaned back in her chair and gave a dry laugh. "You abandoned your kids for 3 years, and now you come back wanting to play the hero. I'm the one who raised them." Michael kept his voice low so Emily wouldn't stir. "You call that raising them? Locking the fridge? Forcing a 7-year-old to take care of his baby sister instead of being a child, while you pocketed the support money for yourself?" Miss Lopez looked up. "Please state your account in detail." Michael drew a deep breath and described his return home, the bathroom scene, his son's words about meals depending on whether the bathtub was scrubbed. He didn't embellish, only reported exactly what he had witnessed with his own eyes. The clerk recorded quickly, then looked toward the door. "Please bring in Mr. Henry Thompson." Mr. Thompson stepped inside, his old hat in his hand, moving slowly but firmly. He placed a large envelope of photographs on the table and slid it toward Miss Lopez. "I've seen that boy many times waiting near the bakery after closing, asking for leftover bread. He never ate right away. He always broke it apart and gave it to his baby sister first. One rainy day I saw him, soaked through, standing outside with her wrapped inside his wet jacket, waiting until the adults allowed him inside. These are pictures I took from a distance. This isn't a story, it's the truth." Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "You were spying on my house?" Mr. Thompson's face didn't change. "I was watching out for those 2 children." Miss Lopez reviewed each photo carefully, nodded slightly, then raised her eyes. "Please bring in Miss Laura Miller." Miss Miller walked in carrying a plastic binder. She introduced herself briefly as Ethan's homeroom teacher, then placed a laminated drawing on the table. "Ethan has been speaking through his drawings. No child invents scenes of carrying a baby sibling while scrubbing a bathtub. He rarely talks, often saves his food to give to his sister, constantly checks the clock, and stands near the classroom door as if afraid of being late for chores at home." She paused a moment. "This drawing shows the bathtub, with an oversized key sketched next to it. And this other one, on the reverse side, shows a light bulb above a dinner table." He wrote the words, "If there were a light." The room fell into stillness. The ceiling fan spun quietly above. Ethan lowered his head, his small fingers gripping the edge of the chair. He spoke very softly, but each word was clear. "I just want my sister to have enough to eat." Margaret shot up from her seat, her chair screeching across the floor. "I have the right to custody. I pay for gas. I pay for electricity. If the kids live under my roof, they follow my rules." Miss Lopez set her pen down and looked straight at her. "Do you receive child support payments for their care?" Margaret hesitated for a moment. "Yes." "Do you have a record book of the children's essential expenses?" Margaret stayed silent. There is evidence of a locked refrigerator. Miss Karen Lopez tilted the file so the clerk could photograph the picture of the padlock. There is evidence of household labor far beyond the child's ability. There is a school report showing signs of exhaustion and prolonged silence. Michael tightened his grip on his son's hand. He no longer looked at Margaret, but into Ethan's eyes, where a thin line of hope had just opened. He spoke slowly, enough for his son to hear. "I'm here." "Miss?" Lopez closed the file and tapped the cover lightly on the table, like a gavel striking once. "Based on the documents and testimony, to ensure the children's immediate safety, temporary custody will be granted to Mr. Michael Carter while the investigation continues. Mrs. Margaret Harris, your actions will be reviewed for child abuse and misappropriation of support funds. Child Protective Services will conduct unannounced home visits to evaluate Mr. Carter's living conditions, and a support plan will be established. During this period, you are not allowed to have private contact with either child without a supervisor present." The room fell silent, heavy as if a thick blanket had dropped. Michael closed his eyes for a second. He could hear Emily's breathing grow steadier. Ethan looked up, his eyes widening, then quickly dropping again, as though afraid that joy might make a sound. Margaret screamed, her voice cracking. "I'll get them back. Don't think you'll escape me so easily." Her hand clutched the ring of keys. The clinking sound rang out again, this time more like a warped challenge. Miss Lopez remained calm. "Sit down, or we will file an obstruction report." Margaret threw a dagger-like glare at Michael, then slowly lowered herself into the chair, her lips still trembling. The clerk read aloud the temporary decision. Mr. Henry Thompson gently touched Michael's shoulder, a wordless gesture of encouragement. Miss Laura Miller took the drawing and handed it back to Ethan. "Keep it, sweetheart. Tonight you can add some light." Ethan hugged the plastic folder to his chest, nodding faintly. Michael picked up the pen. The tip halted midline because of his trembling hand, but then he signed his full name, the slanted letters firm and certain. The hearing concluded. The gavel struck once more. The door opened, and light from the hallway poured in. Michael carried Emily, held Ethan's hand, and stepped out with the deepest, most relieving breath he had taken since coming back. Behind him, Margaret's chair screeched as it was dragged across the floor, her fury scraping against the tiles. Her final words chased him like thorns. "I'll take them back. Just wait." Michael did not look back. He squeezed his son's hand and spoke softly, just enough for the three of them to hear. "From today on, we're going home." That evening, under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp in the small rented room, the faint sound of a spoon tapping against a bowl of rice echoed softly, mixed with Emily's quiet breathing. Michael set his backpack down in the corner, spread a thin blanket over the old mattress, then sat down holding Emily in his arms. Ethan stood at the doorway, still clutching the plastic folder, his eyes scanning the room as if trying to memorize every corner. "Sit here," Michael said slowly, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "I'll cook porridge for your sister." He fumbled as he rinsed a handful of rice, poured in water, and lit the fire. The pot boiled over. He lowered the flame too late, and the smell of burnt rice rose up. He scooped a spoonful, frowned at the thick consistency. Ethan stepped closer half a step, then stopped. "Let me hold her, Dad. You're not used to this yet." Michael gave a strained smile, poured the spoonful into a bowl, added some hot water, stirred carefully. "I want to learn. From now on, you only need to be her brother, not a little father." Ethan set the folder down, wrapped his arms around Emily, lifting her from his father's lap, and gently patted her back in rhythm. Emily quieted, resting her head on her brother's shoulder. Michael blew on the porridge, tasted it again, then held out the spoon. "Slowly now, son." Ethan held the spoon, and Emily puckered her lips to take it. The porridge was a bit thick but warm. Michael looked at the two children, his eyes burning with a new resolve, steady yet tender. After eating, Emily dozed off. Michael laid her down on the mattress, then turned to the plastic basin, scrubbing two small shirts. The water was ice cold. There wasn't much soap, and the bubbles were thin. He rubbed hard, his wrist growing sore. Ethan stood beside him, watching for a moment, then spoke very softly. "At the collar, you have to rub in circles from the edge in. It'll come out cleaner." Michael followed his instruction. He chuckled, his voice lighter. "Teach me more, son. I learn fast." There was a knock at the door. Father and son glanced at each other. Michael opened it slightly. A woman stood outside, holding a cloth bag, short in stature, her graying hair tied neatly in a bun. She smiled and handed the bag over. "I'm Mrs. Helen Parker, from the tamale stand on the corner," she introduced herself, her voice gentle. "I heard Mr. Henry Thompson say you and your children moved in tonight. I brought some canned milk and a blanket. Kids need to sleep warm." Michael accepted the bag, thanking her repeatedly. "Mrs.?" Parker glanced at the mattress, at Emily asleep, and her eyes softened. "I'll come by again tomorrow with some beans and bread. Tonight, let the little ones rest. If you need anything, just knock on my door." She had barely left when footsteps approached again. A middle-aged man stood at the door, a flashlight hanging from his shoulder, the glint of a security guard's cap catching the dim light. He placed a small package on the shelf. "My name's Jacob Reed. I'm the night guard in this area. Mrs. Helen Parker asked me to drop off a small plug-in lamp. It saves electricity. Use it for now. It's brighter than an oil lamp." Michael tried it. A soft white light spread gently, not harsh, just enough to see his children's faces clearly. Ethan squinted for a moment. Then his shoulders relaxed, as if some invisible weight had finally been lifted. Mr. Henry Thompson appeared last. He didn't step far inside, only stood at the doorway, glanced around the room, and gave a small nod. "You've started." Michael smiled wearily. "Thank you, Henry. Without all of you, I would still be fumbling in the dark. Tomorrow you'll go to CPS to finish the paperwork. I'll go with you," Henry reminded him, then turned toward Ethan. "Get some sleep, son. Tomorrow you have to be at school to see your teacher." The room grew quiet again. Michael spread the blanket Mrs. Parker had brought, covered Emily, and tucked the corners snug around her. He sat at the edge of the mattress, stroked the little girl's hair, then turned to his son. "Lie down too." Ethan hesitated, still clutching the plastic folder to his chest. Michael patted the spot beside him. "Lie next to your sister. You don't need to carry her anymore. Here, you just need to be her brother." Slowly, Ethan lay down. He turned his face toward his sister, placed the folder close to the edge of the pillow, and rested his hand on the blanket as if keeping guard out of habit. Michael watched them drift into sleep, his own eyes softening, his breath slowing. He leaned close and whispered, "I will never let anyone take you away from me again." The small lamp glowed steadily. Night settled. Outside, the sound of a distant car, a dog barking for a moment and then quiet. Michael leaned against the wall, fingers interlaced over his knees, running through the next day in his mind. Go to CPS with Henry. Stop by school to meet Miss Laura Miller. Ask for the materials Ethan needed. Find a clinic for Emily. And later in the afternoon inquire about a night shift at a nearby hotel. He stood, hung two freshly washed shirts on the line across the window. Water still dripped, but the stains around the collars had faded. He blew out the oil lamp, leaving only the soft glow of the small light. The room wasn't entirely dark now, just enough light to outline the peaceful curves of his children's faces. After a while, Ethan stirred. He opened his eyes, looked around as if to make sure everything was safe, then sat up quietly so as not to wake Emily. He dug into his school bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, holding it with both hands as if it were something precious. "Dad," he whispered. Michael looked up. "What is it, son?" Ethan glanced at the plastic folder on the pillow, then back at the new sheet of paper. The glow of the lamp caught in his eyes, leaving a glimmer. "I drew another picture. Do you want to see it?" Morning light slid across the pencil drawing. Ethan unfolded it, holding the edges with both hands, his eyes fixed on his father to read his reaction. "I drew this last night," he said softly. 3 people sitting around the dinner table. The refrigerator is open. There's a light. Michael held the paper. On it, 3 stick figures sat close together, a round bowl of rice in the middle, and behind them the refrigerator door cracked open, with lines of light spreading out. His throat tightened. He pulled Ethan into his arms. "This is your real dream." Ethan nodded slightly, pressing his lips together to keep from crying. "I want the light to be on the table, not outside the door." Emily stirred, made a faint sound, then drifted back to sleep. Michael set the drawing on the shelf and stroked the warm hair of his son. He was about to say more when a knock came at the door. A familiar female voice called, "Good morning. I'm Miss Karen Lopez from CPS. I'm here to inspect the home and deliver the results." Michael opened the door. "Miss?" Lopez stood with a young man wearing a name badge that read, "Officer James Romero, CPS." Both showed their IDs and asked permission to step inside. Their eyes passed over the neatly made mattress, the rinsed-out bowl on the shelf, two small children's shirts hanging by the window, and then stopped at the drawing. "We'll record the current conditions," Romero said in a calm voice. "Can you tell us how you arranged meals and sleep for the children yesterday?" Michael answered briefly. Rice porridge for Emily, bread from Mrs. Helen Parker, warm blankets, a small lamp from the night guard, Mr. Jacob Reed. Miss Lopez noted it all in her report. She looked at Ethan, lowering her voice to be gentle. "You're Ethan, right? I saw your drawings yesterday. Did you draw anything else today?" Ethan pointed to the paper on the shelf. "I drew the refrigerator open." Romero smiled. "An open refrigerator is a good sign." He added a note, then turned to Michael. "Have you taken little Emily to the health clinic yet?" "This afternoon I'll take her for a checkup," Michael replied. "Then I'll stop by the school to meet with Miss Laura Miller about Ethan's enrollment." Miss Lopez closed the folder and looked directly at Michael. "The investigation is complete. Margaret Harris has been ordered to return the subsidy. She has lost custody, and the case has been forwarded to the prosecutor for abuse. As of today, legal custody belongs to you." The words fell like a lock clicking open inside his chest. Michael collapsed onto the edge of the mattress, his hand pressed against his forehead, tears spilling faster than he could stop them. He turned and pulled Ethan tightly into his arms, then kissed Emily's forehead. "Dad, don't cry." Ethan placed his small hand on his father's back. "Now we finally have a home." Miss Karen Lopez handed Michael a folder. "This is the official decision and the list of initial support. Milk, free medical checkups, temporary food assistance. If anyone comes to bother you, call us immediately." She looked around once more, her eyes softer now. "You've started in the right way." Officer James Romero stood up and gave a short nod. "We'll come back unannounced in a few weeks to follow up. But rest assured, today is a turning point." When they left, Mrs. Helen Parker stopped by, setting down a bag of warm bread. "I heard the footsteps of state workers and knew it was good news." She smiled, glancing at the drawing. "How beautiful. Keep it safe, Nino." That afternoon, Michael took Emily to the community health clinic. The doctor weighed her, gave instructions about her formula, and scheduled booster shots. On the way back, he stopped by the school to meet Miss Laura Miller and signed the re-enrollment form for Ethan. She handed him an extra blank notebook. "Write down what you see each day, even just one line," she told Ethan. "Whenever you want to talk, I'll be here to listen." Ethan held the notebook without a word, but his hands clutched it tightly. Back at the small apartment, he took out a pencil and wrote 3 large words on the first page. Table light. That evening, Emily fell asleep early. Michael set a small table close to the bed, placed a bowl of rice, 2 pairs of chopsticks, and a glass of water. He looked at his son. "Let's eat a little more. We've got plenty to do tomorrow." Ethan sat down, his eyes on the lamp. "Dad, turn it on." The small light came on. On the table, the white rice reflected a soft glow. Michael placed a piece of egg into his son's bowl, keeping a smaller piece for himself. Ethan pushed it back. "Dad, you should eat more. I'm fine." "Go ahead and eat." Michael smiled. "It's enough for me just to see you eat." They ate slowly, without many words. Every clink of the spoon against the bowl carried a rare, quiet peace. Afterward, Michael washed the dishes, dried them, and hung the towel on a nail. When he turned around, he saw Ethan opening the notebook, carefully pasting that morning's drawing onto the second page, and writing beneath it in neat letters. 3 people, fridge open, night fell. The wind slipped through the cracks in the door, making a faint sound. Michael dimmed the light, leaving only a soft glow shining over the bed. He sat down, pulled a blanket over Emily, smoothed Ethan's hair, and whispered, "From today on, this is our home." Ethan was silent for a moment, then turned his face toward the wall. His voice was low, like a breeze slipping across the edge of the blanket. "I'm scared that she'll come back." Michael laid his hand on his son's back. "If she comes, I'll be the one standing at the door. All you have to do is stay behind me." Ethan gave a small nod. He closed his eyes, but his eyelashes still trembled. Michael sat there, cracking his knuckles, listening as his heartbeat began to steady. He reminded himself to change the lock on the door, to ask Mr. Jacob Reed to watch out during his night shifts, and to call Miss Lopez if there were any strange signs. Suddenly, the light in the room flickered once and went out. Darkness fell over them. Emily startled and cried out. Ethan jumped up, holding his sister's shoulders, his other hand reaching for his father's arm. From the alley outside came the sound of footsteps. Not fast, not slow, but deliberate. Then they stopped right in front of the door. No one spoke. Only the sound of 3 breaths inside the room, blending with the night stretched tight as a wire. The pounding on the door was relentless. The light bulb had just gone out, leaving the room in darkness. Margaret's shrill voice screeched from the yard. "Give Emily back to me, she's my daughter." Emily startled awake, screaming in terror. Ethan clutched her tightly, his eyes wide with fear. Michael pulled both children behind him, standing firm in front of the door, one hand pressed against the latch. He drew in a deep breath, steadying his voice. "Margaret, you are not allowed unsupervised contact. Child Protective Services has already made their decision." A heavy fist slammed against the wood. "Open this door." I said, "Open it." Michael leaned down and whispered to his son. "Ethan, take your sister and sit against the wall. I'm right here." From outside came the sound of running footsteps. A beam of flashlight swept across the wall. Mr. Henry Thompson's gravelly but steady voice called out, "What's going on here?" Margaret spun toward him. "Stay out of this." Mr. Thompson ignored her and shouted toward the house. "Michael, let me call 911. He dialed quickly, speaking concisely to the dispatcher. The address, the name of the aggressor, the custody ruling from CPS. Another flashlight appeared. "It's Jacob Reed, night security," the guard said, stepping through the gate with a glowing baton in his hand. Behind him, Mrs. Helen Parker arrived, clutching a folded blanket, panting for breath. Around them, neighbors cracked open their doors, the glow of phone lights spilling out as a small crowd formed. Margaret slammed her fist against the door again. "Give me my child." Michael opened the door just a crack, his body still blocking the way. "If you really wanted your child, you would have raised her with love instead of locks and fear. You've already lost custody. Stop terrifying these kids." "Don't preach to me," she spat, lunging forward. But Jacob Reed and Mr. Thompson stepped in, holding her back. Mrs. Parker moved quickly, pulling the blanket up to shield the children's faces through the crack of the door. "Don't look, little ones." The wail of sirens grew louder until red and blue lights flashed against the walls. 2 officers entered the yard. One tall and lean with a badge that read Officer Daniel Hernandez, the other heavier set, his rank clear on his uniform Sergeant Robert Vega. Vega's voice rang firm and controlled. "Good evening. Which one of you is Margaret?" "I am." Margaret snapped her chin up. "They're stealing my child." Vega opened his case file and pulled out paperwork. "We have a warrant from the district attorney's office based on the recommendation of Child Protective Services. Margaret Harris, you are charged with child abuse and misappropriation of support funds. We are placing you under arrest. You have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney." Margaret's face went pale for half a second, then she shrieked. "No one is taking her from me. That little girl is." Officer Hernandez stepped forward, calm but firm, turning her around. The handcuffs clicked with a sharp snap. "Please cooperate, ma'am," the crowd murmured, flashlights converging in the small yard. Mrs. Helen Parker shook her head and sighed. "Mr. Jacob Reed stepped closer to the gate, scanning the shadows as if checking for any accomplice of the woman. Mr. Henry Thompson placed his hand on the door of the apartment and called in gently, as he always did. "Michael, it's all right now. The police are here." Michael Carter opened the door a little wider. He still stood shielding his children, his eyes locked on Margaret Harris. She struggled, trying to turn back to look at him, her gaze spitting fire. "Michael, I'll be back. Don't think you'll get away from me so easily." Sergeant Robert Vega leaned in, keeping a safe distance. "That's enough, ma'am." Ethan pressed himself against his father's back, his voice trembling but clear. "Dad, we're safe now." Michael gave a small nod. "Yes, we're safe now." The words came out like a wave of warmth wrapping around the 3 of them. The officers escorted Margaret to the car. She glanced back one last time, her eyes venomous. But in the darkness of that narrow yard, the eyes of the neighbors that met hers carried only coldness and contempt. The car door slammed shut. The engine started. The flashing red and blue lights faded at the end of the street. The yard grew quiet again. Jacob Reed straightened his flashlight, shone it on the breaker panel in the hallway, and flipped a switch. The small bulb inside the apartment came back on. Its soft glow spread across the 4 walls. Emily stopped crying, whimpered a little, then drifted back to sleep. Ethan's shoulders loosened. his small hand that had clutched his father's shirt finally letting go, replaced by a tight hug around his waist. Mrs. Parker laid a folded blanket on the table and exhaled with relief. "Tomorrow, I'll bring over a pot of chicken soup. These little ones need something warm in their bellies." Jacob Reed gave a nod of farewell, walked around along the alley, then returned to say to Michael, "I'll add extra patrols these next few nights. If anything unusual happens, call me right away." "Thank you, all of you," Michael said, his voice deep and warm. "Without you, tonight would have been unbearably long." Mr. Thompson stepped inside, glanced around once. He didn't waste words. He simply laid his rough hand on Michael's shoulder, squeezing gently as if to pass on strength. "Now it's time to rebuild a real home." Michael lifted Emily and pressed his forehead to Ethan's. Father and son looked at each other. Ethan's lips trembled. Michael's eyes blurred. They both broke into tears, not from fear, but from something heavy finally falling away. Mrs. Parker quietly stepped back, closing the door softly to leave the three of them in peace. Inside, the small light shone on the drawing pasted into a notebook. 3 people. The fridge is open. Michael laid Emily on the mattress, pulled a blanket over her, then wrapped Ethan in his arms. Their breathing slowly fell into rhythm, steady and deep. Out on the porch, Henry Thompson and Jacob Reed stood a moment longer, nodded to each other, then dispersed like 2 quiet sentinels guarding the end of the alley. The night, at last, did not feel endless. Yet in that final silence, Michael knew the harder part was just beginning. Rebuilding daily life, sending his son back to school, healing the invisible wounds of fear. He wiped away Ethan's tears and whispered so both little hearts could hear it clearly. "From tomorrow on, I'll lay the foundation of this home. All you need to do is grow up." Children's laughter echoed across the small yard. Golden sunlight poured down the steps as if someone had laid a warm blanket there. Michael carried Emily through the narrow walkway, his other hand holding a box of belongings. Ethan ran ahead, calling out, "Watch the step, Dad." The new house was simple: 2 rooms, a small kitchen, open windows. Not much, but enough to breathe. The landlord, Mr. William Harper, a sturdy man in his 50s, handed over the keys with a kind smile. "The locks are solid, the wiring's all new. If anything breaks, call me." He glanced at the children, then lowered his voice as if reminding himself, "This house doesn't have a locked fridge, kid." Michael laughed, shook his hand, and thanked him for the quiet kindness. Neighbors stopped by one after another. Mrs. Helen Parker arrived with a steaming pot of caldo, fragrant in the air. For the children, eat and take a good nap afterward. Mr. Jacob Reed, the night guard, brought a new LED lamp, saying it saved electricity but shined brighter. Mr. Henry Thompson carefully wrapped a smooth pine board, carved with a simple sign, "Michael's Home." He handed it over softly. "Hang it on the door, so the kids will remember this is their home." Miss Laura Miller came last, her hair neatly tied back, holding a paper bag. She handed Ethan a thick sketchbook with a small label on the corner. "For Ethan, draw what you want." She touched his shoulder gently, her voice warm. "Draw the things you want, not the things you fear." Their first meal together was set on an old wooden table Mr. Harper had lent them. Mrs. Parker's caldo, some fresh bread, and a plate of scrambled eggs Michael had just made. Everyone sat around, speaking and laughing just enough, not too loud. Emily babbled, pointed at her bowl, and stumbled over a word but made it clear. "Papa." The whole table went silent for a heartbeat, then burst into soft laughter and clapping. Michael held his little girl, eyes stinging though he was smiling wide. "Say it again." Emily cupped his face in her small hands, tried again. "Papa." Ethan opened his new sketchbook. He didn't look at anyone, only at the blank page. With a pencil he drew slowly, his hands no longer shaking. He sketched a tall figure holding the hand of a smaller one walking past low trees. Above, he drew a long streak of sunlight. In the corner, he added a small dot running clumsily. "This is Emily." Then he lifted his head and handed the sketchbook to Michael. "This is the first time I drew a park," Ethan said, his voice steady but shining. "No dripping water, just sunlight." Michael studied the drawing for a long time. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You draw what you want, and I'll take you there." It wasn't a grand promise, just those words, but his whole body felt lighter, as if a knot had finally been untied. The group around the table slowly dispersed. Mrs. Parker kissed Emily's forehead and reminded them to keep her warm. Mr. Reed promised to add an extra patrol round that night. Mr. Harper stood at the door, nodding toward Mr. Thompson as if sealing a quiet pact of reassurance. Miss Miller gathered the wrapping paper and spoke softly to Michael. "Tomorrow, I'll ask the school counseling office to do a light evaluation for Ethan. No rush, but it's better to start early." Michael nodded. "Thank you. Everything finally feels like it's in the right place." The door closed, and the house grew quieter. Michael washed the dishes while Ethan wiped the table. Emily waddled around clutching a stuffed bear someone had given her, turning back now and then to call Daddy, as if testing whether the word still worked. Each time, Michael answered, "I'm here, sweetheart. Right here, with you." As night fell, the breeze slipped in through the window but carried no chill. Michael hung the wooden plaque that read Michael's home by the door. He looked at it for a moment, then went back inside. He didn't need many words. Peace spoke for itself. Ethan spread his sketchbook on the table. On the first page, he pasted the drawing of the park. On the second page, he placed the one titled, "3 People, Open Fridge," and beneath it, he wrote in small letters, "A Table with Light." Michael stood behind him, resting his hand lightly on the back of his son's neck. He didn't rush him, didn't correct him, he was simply there. Emily fell asleep early. Michael lifted her into a borrowed crib, pulled a blanket over her, and touched her forehead warm and calm. Ethan slipped under the blanket on the bed beside her, clutching the sketchbook as if it were a promise. Inside Michael's chest, a vast stillness settled. Not the emptiness of silence, but a silence filled with the rhythm of breathing, the faint sound of a spoon against a bowl, the fragile new word, Daddy. For the first time, he felt he was truly a father, not just a man who paid debts or arrived too late. He dimmed the lights, leaving only a small lamp glowing on the wall. Its light fell on the picture he had just hung. 3 people sitting at the dinner table, the fridge door open, warm light spilling out. No locks, no shadows. Michael stood there for a long moment, as though before a doorway that had finally swung wide. He turned back, watching his 2 children sleep soundly. Their breathing was steady, their faces relaxed. From time to time, Emily's lips moved in a drowsy half-smile. Ethan no longer clutched the old plastic folder in fear, but held his new sketchbook the way someone holds a future. Michael bent down, brought his lips close to their ears, and whispered slowly so each word could sink into their dreams. "Now we truly have a home." Outside in the yard, the wind brushed against the wooden plaque, touching the carved words "Michael's home" before scattering away like an answer. Inside, the picture on the wall remained still but warm, a testimony that from this day forward, every meal would have light and every old fear was left behind. When Michael Carter opened that door, he saw not just a poor house, but the stolen childhood of his children. He chose to stay, not to run. And from that moment on, we know that what is right will prevail. The wicked will be punished, and the good will be rewarded. Justice does not arrive through grand promises, but through small hands held tightly, through a single light bulb bright enough to warm a dinner table, through the voices of honest neighbors and a teacher who chose to listen. This story is dedicated to all who have endured in silence. If you are tired, please remember, there will always be a Mr. Henry Thompson ready to knock on your door, a Miss Laura Miller willing to testify, and a Michael Carter clumsily learning how to cook porridge just so his children won't go hungry. Kindness is never loud, but persistent kindness can change an entire destiny. Now it is your turn. The people I cherish on this channel. Which moment touched you the most? The drawing of the open fridge, the very first Daddy, or the moment when the whole community stood together to protect 2 children? If there were a child in your neighborhood who needed help, what would you do first? What words of encouragement would you send to single fathers and mothers who fight every day for their children? Where are you watching from today? And how has your day been? Share with us one small good thing you've witnessed recently, so we can keep building trust together. If this story touched you, please leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and follow this channel so you won't miss the next story of healing. Thank you for being here, because as long as one heart chooses to stay, the light above the dinner table will always shine.